Welcome, everyone, to the last session, but critically important session of this wonderful conference that we've had over the last couple of days. This session is all about caring for caregivers, a topic I think that is vastly expanding and of significant interest to the community more and more, which is why the conference organizers have pulled together a really interesting an expansive conversation for us today that really is going to explore the unique needs of caregivers, such as getting used to the caregiving role, managing some difficult conversations, and some of the fears that come along with managing the needs of your loved ones that caregivers are caring for. So, I'd like to introduce you to our two speakers in this session. The first is Dave Robb, who is a caregiver to his wife, Michelle, living in Belleville, Ontario. He's been retired since January 2020 after a big career in municipal government and supply chain management. Dave and Michelle are big dog lovers, and they currently have a rescue dog who goes by the name of Emmylou. Michelle, Dave's wife, was diagnosed with stage 4 colorectal cancer that had metastasized to her liver in May of 2017. Since then, she underwent 23 surgeries, chemo, and radiation therapy, and has been cancer-free now for 3 years. Dave, of course, has been a primary caregiver to Michelle. With us also, and we're very excited to welcome Dr. Anita Mehta, who has a specialty in palliative care focused on family dynamics at the end of life. For much of her career, she has worked with patients and families dealing with illness, life transitions, family loss, family trauma, loss and grief, role changes, distress, anxiety, and depression. I can think of no one better to be a part of this session than Dr. Mehta. Today, she works at the Jewish General Hospital as a nurse care counselor and couple and family therapist in the Department of Psychiatry. She is the Director of Education and Knowledge Exchange at the Teresa Dellar Palliative Care Residence and has a private practice as a psychotherapist where she sees and supports individuals, couples, and families. I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Mehta to lead this session and to have a wonderful conversation with Dave today.
Thank you very much. I first wanted to start by thanking you, Dave, for sharing or being willing to share, I guess, your really personal story. And so I was hoping you would kind of set the stage for us and talk to us a little bit about what your experience was like when you first got the diagnosis.
All right. Thank you, Anita. As was mentioned, Michelle was diagnosed in May 2017. Prior to that, we had really been healthy. We were both sort of focused on healthy lifestyle in terms of diet and activity level. And like a lot of things in life, I guess it just happens out of the blue. So I'll just share some of my thoughts and observations, feelings from that period. And the more I've been thinking about it, as I mentioned to the group prior to the call here, new thoughts have come up, and I've kind of reimagined, if you will, some of the events as best I can. Anyways, my first thought is there's no really definitive book on how to be a caregiver. When your partner is diagnosed with cancer, there's lots of literature, support team for the patient, and there should be, because it's a, again, a lot of new information. But in terms of the caregiver, there's no real literature or support. So you dive in, and I guess like a lot of things in life, you're never really fully prepared. Never fully prepared to be a parent, never fully prepared for that promotion at work or whatever. And having said that, I guess my next observation is you're gonna make mistakes. You sort of dive in. So I think what you have to do right from the outset is forgive yourself, that you're going to make mistakes, but it's part of the process. The biggest advice I could give to someone is to be a good listener, especially for your partner, and really try to determine what their needs are and what they want. Because I think a lot of times you're in this situation and everybody wants to help, and you have ideas, and sometimes you think, well, maybe this would be a good idea. But I think because of it's self-evident, but it is a very emotionally charged experience. So I think it's tread lightly. I think listen to your partner, to what their needs are, and prioritize them. One of the things that occurred to me, and I hadn't thought about it in a while, is even though it's a catastrophic change when you get a cancer diagnosis, there is strangely an intensity and a focus in your life at that point. And in a bizarre way, it does make you feel alive. I know I wouldn't recommend anybody to go through the experience, but there is an intensity to it. And you're living day to day at the beginning, and you're just going from one day to the next, figuring out, okay, what worked, and realizing that maybe the next day you're going to be feeling different, or your partner's needs are going to be different. Other things I could say is just sort of be there. You're not necessarily there to provide advice, whatever that is. And you're going to feel that your life is out of control. And that can be disconcerting. But I think if you accept it, realize that it's just part of the journey.
Right. So Dave, can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
As you're speaking, I'm, part of what you said really struck me, that there's no way to prepare for this. And I often
Yes.
hear from family members when I'm working with them is they're kind of launched into this role. They go from husband to caregiver.
Yeah.
And that's a big change in role and definition and just in the relationship. And I'm curious if you were ever asked if you were ready for this, or if you were asked if you were okay being a caregiver.
No. Now that you asked the question, no, nobody sort of says, "Okay, you're ready for this," or or gives you any idea. It was just sort of, it sounds a bit crass to say you're an afterthought, because the focus is on the person with the cancer, and but no, you just sort of one moment your life's fine, and the next moment it isn't, and again, because of the the emotional intensity of the whole situation. Another thing is, it's possible for partners to say things to each other in the spur of the moment that they wouldn't otherwise. And again, that's something and I think for the most part, Michelle and I were pretty good. But you just got to move on from that.
So looking
Go ahead.
back, this idea of not being prepared, um, what would have been helpful in terms of sort of having the right questions asked you? And I asked the question because it really strikes me. You're not the first caregiver to say no one asked me, and here I am giving 110% in this role that I had no preparation for. And I'd be curious if you'd be surprised to learn that the research actually shows that it's family caregivers of cancer patients that have higher incidences of anxiety, distress, and depression. It's not the patients, it's the
Wow,
caregivers.
I did not know that. No. Um, I think it would have been useful if there was information or resource available just for someone I need to acknowledge your situation to say to you, what you're feeling is normal. Because you, yeah, just to say, okay, just like somebody who's perhaps, use the analogy, if you've got mental illness, just for somebody to say, you know what, you're not the first person to have this situation. Um, it's other people have gone through this before. What you're feeling goes with the territory. So I think because you're kind of thinking, what should I be doing now, or am I doing it right? Thinking that there is some sort of right or wrong way, and I think looking back, and that's one of the other things when I reflected on it over the past week or so, that my experience is my experience, and I think the dynamic between the patient and the caregiver is, to some extent, there's going to be commonalities, but there's going to be uniqueness to the nature of the relationship, the personalities, and whatever. So, what might be successful for some person perhaps may not fit for another. But I think there certainly are some strategies, common strategies that will help to some degree for everyone.
Are you comfortable sharing what some of those helpful strategies were for you?
One of the ones, I was very fortunate because I was working at the time, but I had a very flexible employer, and gave me a lot of freedom, flexibility in terms of time off. Basically, she just said, you know what, if you need to leave, or you just phone in at the spur of the moment and say, you know what, I can't be in today, or I've got to leave work now, or whatever. And I know, talking to some friends later on, that isn't always the circumstance. You think it would be, but not everybody has that um, uh, availability to have a very flexible schedule. The other thing too, I had a couple of colleagues at work, because Michelle was reticent initially to share her experience, and that's, I respect her feelings, and everybody's different, and I think it's something, as you move along in the treatment process, your ideas change, because then later on she was more open to it. But initially, she wanted to keep it within a close circle, and so I respected that. But I need it personally. Some folks that I could confide in at work, even if I kept it to a small group of 3 or 4. So I had a tremendous assistant who worked with me, and as fate would have it, she had survived cancer years ago, and she was tremendous for me to just pick up the slack, or just come in the office and say, "How are you doing today?" It was just very easy to talk with her. So that was a big stress reliever, not having to deal with additional demands and stress at work, and having a few close friends. Because I think as a caregiver, you need an opportunity to step away at times and just sort of relax and re-energize, and to be able to talk with those friends openly. And you don't want to talk, and that's the other thing I think, is you can't really talk about cancer 24/7. It's not a problem that you're going to resolve by overthinking or thinking. You have to, if anything, you have to make it a priority to shut down your thinking and just try to live in the moment. Because I think when you get a situation like that, you realize a lot of what you really want is just return to your normal life. And you realize the small things that you took for granted in a day, just sharing a meal together or walk together, the conversation, those things that are just day-to-day activities are really what you want to get back to and to get away from cancer.
I'm
Um,
so happy that you brought up this idea of that social network or that support. I think I work with a lot of family caregivers who just say, I don't have time to take care of me. I'm so
yeah.
busy taking care of somebody else that I'm not really even on the radar when it comes to taking care of myself. So I think that's really a critical piece of advice that you're sharing. Were there other things besides having a social network or someplace to put your thoughts and feelings that you felt helped with your capacity to take that step back that you're mentioning was so important to look after yourself?
I think one of the things Michelle did, which I think was a really good idea for both of us from an early day, is she set aside a part of our house, which was the sun porch at the back of the house, because she was diagnosed in May. So it was just sort of the end of spring, beginning of summer, although we remembered it was, as you remember the finer details when you go through the experience, it was one of the wettest, rainiest summers in years. But anyways, we had kind of a, if you will, kind of a sanctuary or a serene place. And, she could look out the windows, the backyard, at the flower gardens and the birds. And it was at the back of the house, so you're away from the traffic. And so that turned out to be kind of a sanctuary not only for her, but I think was very therapeutic to myself. So a bit of an escape. And I think that goes sort of on the same theme is I think it's hard for any caregiver to do it on their own, not only having, a network at work. Michelle had a good network of her family and close friends that were able to come in and kind of provide a change of scenery in terms of rather than seeing me all the time and giving her a different perspective and giving me a break. And after, I took time off, obviously, for the surgeries and a couple of weeks and weeks off when she was going through other things. But, when I had to go back to work, and even though, and one of the things I guess that was useful in our situation financially, we were okay. Even though Michelle was off work, there's a limited amount of benefits available through EI for disability. But financially, we didn't have a problem because I'd heard of circumstances where somebody even undergoing chemotherapy had to go back in between chemo sessions just to pay the bills. We didn't have that worry. But her family, her brothers, her sisters, her mom, some other close friends. I think if you were dependent on a single caregiver, no matter um, how dedicated you are, I think you would get worn down.
Okay. What would you say to family caregivers who are reluctant or hesitant to ask for help? This idea that, and we talked a little bit about how unprepared you can be, but this idea that it's your duty, it's your responsibility as the person who loves the patient to take it all on and that you should be able to manage it all. And often when I suggest to seek some kind of support or ask for help, it's often a dismissive, no, 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 I've got this. I'm okay.
I would say, given my own experience, and my dad passed away from cancer. Now, at that point, I wasn't, the caregiver per se. My mom was there, but I was dropping in obviously every day, so different feeling. But one commonality to start with, is that you don't realize when you're in this situation, and I guess it's not unique to cancer and the caregiver situation, but you don't realize the level of stress that you're operating under and functioning under on a daily basis. And I guess your mind and your body manage to find a way to get through it. But when that situation is ended, it's kind of like an elephant off your back, and you realize, oh my God, that was a tremendous exertion. And looking back from that, I would say that you can probably be a better caregiver if you have an opportunity to take those breaks. I think if you're trying to do it and say, okay, no, I'm fine, I can get through this, I'll do what I need to do. But I think if you recognize, if I take time to look after myself, I'm going to be better prepared when I go in there. I'm going to be a better listener. I'm going to be, because there is a possibility if you spend 24/7 in a very intense situation that you can create conflict, even though under the best intentions, and even entering a situation with a strong relationship. So that's kind of, and I guess maybe it comes back to maybe feeling of guilt. So I think you have to say, okay, I shouldn't feel guilty for looking after myself. I never had. I guess you could have a sense of guilt, feeling that why did my partner get the cancer, not me? Everyone always thinks, well, it'd be easier for me to. In some ways, you think it'd be easier for me to be the one who needs the care than to care for the person. Just things like, okay, it's one less thing to control. But yeah, that's some of the thoughts that kind of come to mind.
So glad that
Especially,
you brought up
go ahead.
I was just going to say that I'm so glad that you brought up the emotion or the feeling of guilt, because that's something that's so common in family members, and this idea of taking care away from the patient and putting the spotlight sort of on themselves. And that old analogy about the oxygen that falls off in the
Right.
plane, and how you have to put the mask on first, and then you worry about the other people, because if you don't take care of yourself, it becomes very challenging to look after someone else. And in the end, your primary goal is to look after the person you love, and you're unable to because you're crashing and burning. So I think that's such a good way of framing it. The way you've done that is, you can't look after the other person if you're not looking after yourself.
Yeah.
I was also curious about sort of the roles you may have had to take on as a family caregiver. And I've had a caregiver once say to me, I don't like this term caregiver. I'm the wife. I just want to be the wife. Please stop calling me a caregiver. And it really struck me because it spoke to this incredible capacity that you have to take on. You become the accountant, the taxi driver, the manager, the secretary, the nurse sometimes, and you take on all these different roles that you weren't expecting or prepared for, and you just want to be the person that's loved or in this relationship. And so I'm curious about sort of your perspective on some of these roles that you had to take on, unexpected or not.
Um, I think we were fortunate in the sense that um, we did share and do share a lot of the tasks around the house in terms of cooking, cleaning, um, yard work, financials. There's a lot of couples that isn't the case. Maybe you have your wife is doing all the domestics, quote unquote. So it was a little easier, but that does bring up the point we had to make some decisions, and I was sort of a little stubborn on it. And Michelle said, "Look, we need to get somebody to look after the yard, cut the grass, not just keep it so it's presentable." And I was kind of saying, "No, no, 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 I can do that. I like doing that." And then I finally realized, no, she was right. And so we did contract with a couple of folks to do the yard. And then her brother-in-law came over and very generously offered to do the spring preparation on the backyard, because again, I was mentioning that she was her sanctuary was sort of at the back of the house overlooking the backyard. And again, because of circumstances, if you don't get out in a garden early in the spring and maintain it, and it was getting out of control. So he came over with a couple of friends, and that helped immensely. And when I think back about it, because we actually have a cottage, which is about 20, 25 minutes away. And I don't know how what we do rent it out a lot. We mustn't have rented it out that summer. I can't remember. It's all a haze. But even just doing the yard work, certainly not as big, but yeah, so you got to reach out for something and make some decisions regarding some of the tasks. And again, fortunately, we were starting from a point where we did share a lot of them. Because, well, even in a situation from banking, financials, budgeting, buying groceries, if you had no familiarity with that and throw that on top of everything else, yeah, could really be very, very challenging.
You mentioned, briefly that you had the capacity to kind of stay with Michelle and take the time off work. And you also touched on very briefly communication and this idea of conflict, and I'm stubborn. And so I'm very curious about what communication looked like between the two of you. Sometimes it's hard to talk about the elephant in the room. It does sound like you were able to really conversations with Michelle, but I'm curious if there were ever any challenges to just talking about what was going on.
It's a good question. I guess I'm more the type we're somewhat different because I'm not one to really dwell on a situation like in terms of the cancer, I guess. And I guess I'll have to admit openly, I was, you're trying to think, should I talk about it or should I not talk about it? Certainly I went to all the appointments, and there were a few occasions where we had her sister or friends were able to take the chemo, but I generally like to go to chemo with her. Did we talk about? I was careful to talk too much about it. You don't want to say something that could be potentially conflictual. Now, certainly, I would advise anybody. I can't imagine having cancer, not having. You should have somebody go to the doctor's appointments as a second to that, a spouse or friend, a parent, sibling, whatever, because the information, when you're the patient, trying to retain all that information, and we would come out of those appointments and we would say, okay, this, and this would be sort of my takeaways, and Michelle might come up with this, and this, and there would be differences, or she would hear something that I had and that I had missed, and vice versa, or we would misinterpret what the doctor had said and how that, she might interpret it, I might say in a negative manner, and I might say, okay, that's sort of a ray of optimism. So I think we kind of learn to navigate those conversations very carefully. I guess I tend to be more of an optimist for whatever reason, and I don't really know why, because when she was diagnosed, it spread to her liver, which is usually the scenario. The prognosis is not very good at that point. We didn't know all that stuff at the time. And fortunately, things turned out very, very good, and she's been in remission for 5 years. So I had to sort of stem my optimism, because when you're the patient, you're always a little guarded. So that at times could be a point of conflict. And I would say to Michelle, let's talk about the notes, the recommendations, the observations from the doctor's appointment, and then kind of put it in a little compartment and we don't need to talk about it because we've taken all the action items we need to do. And that's sort of the way what I would do. I put it in a compartment and forget about it till I need it again. Wouldn't forget about it, put it away. Whereas by her nature is one to more to dwell on something and come back to it later in the day. And I'm saying, okay, there's no value to that because all you're doing a lot of times is increasing your anxiety, trying to interpret something into what the doctor has said and said, okay, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Or, does that mean I'm getting better or whatever? And I was kind of like, well, there's no value in the conversation. So again, I had to say that, or maybe just let her talk because, to me to say, okay, you're just making yourself more anxious. Sometimes I think that's going to make her more anxious. So I have to let her kind of go through that process of stage by stage, going through that doctor appointment and making sense of it and coming out with a conclusion. So again, and I guess my other comment is, like you say, you can't do the 24/7 answer thing, but certainly, I'm sure there were sometimes some conflict, but I think there were certainly more the exception than the rule. And I'm not necessarily saying that's because of what I did or necessarily, but I think you kind of learn on a day-to-day basis sort of the trigger points and what conversation maybe today will work and what conversation won't work. And for the most part, I think I let her take the lead on what she wanted to talk about and what she wanted to do, because I think she knows her needs better than I do.
So it's interesting that, that you said I don't want to say it's because of something I did, but it very likely is. It really sounds like you took the time to sort of give her the space to learn how to read her cues and, very importantly, follow her lead. And it's also interesting that you said, she was the more guarded one, but it certainly seems like you had to work on being a bit guarded and really tailor the content and the timing of what you were going to say. And I wonder if you sometimes held back and had thoughts or feelings that you didn't feel like you could share with her. Did that happen sometimes?
Yeah, I think you're right. And another thing that's occurred to me, Anita, since you've been talking, I can remember when we would go to not so much the chemo, well, probably the chemo too, but any appointments, probably chemo, and certainly with the surgeries, I would drive from Belleville to Kingston, and that's about a 50-minute an hour drive. And typically, neither of us would say a word, because she'd kind of be in her space at that point. And I think initially we thought, oh, well, perhaps you should have some conversation. And it just seemed like any conversation was kind of unnecessary and inadequate. And initially you thought, oh, well, I'm not really, I'm not being a very good partner here because, but then we realized that's what she needed. And I think that's what both of us needed. And it worked for us. And neither of us felt, I think, any level of resentment because neither one was saying anything. There's a point where the conversation is just not, words can't adequately express what you're going through. And I don't know if there's anybody can say anything at that point that is going to say, well, nobody knows at that point what the news is going to be. You can't go in there and say, oh, your blood test is going to be good or your results are going to be good or whatever. That's just optimism that's not even based in any bit of reality. So I think it's, I hate to, it's almost, you have to be prepared for the worst and hope for the best, I guess, because it's a real balancing act to maintain especially, for the patient, to maintain their perspective. You're always constantly thinking, okay, something's really going to go bad. Or, I just felt a little different today. What What is that an indication of?
I think I'm really struck by this image of the two of you silent in a car driving, but I think you've underlined probably the single most important thing a family caregiver can do, and that's the gift of being present. And sometimes
Absolutely.
that is enough.
Yep, absolutely. Just being
Yeah,
present. Um, yeah, and that's all you need is for the person to know that you're going to be there regardless of what goes on. You don't have to worry about driving. You don't have to worry about parking. You don't have to worry about checked into the hospital. You just have to worry about focus on doing what you need to do to get better as a patient. And then look after the other details. There was kind of like I say, initially maybe a bit of an awkwardness to the silence, and then you realize that that's just the way it should be. It's kind of it's a bad analogy, but going back to my many years ago and being an athlete, it's kind of like when you're in preparation for a big game. It's just total silence and focus and being in the moment.
I think people are often surprised to hear when I say that just 7% of communication is verbal. That
Wow.
93% of what you're not saying, how you're looking at your partner, the silence you use, a particular touch, that's communicating a lot. I'm here, I'm present, I'm listening. All of that you seem to have done quite beautifully without even realizing that it was quite a powerful intervention.
Well, I'm feeling a bit better now that you
And
said that.
I think family caregivers put on so much responsibility on themselves, and you place yourselves at quite a high standard.
Yeah.
And there's a reason caregivers burn out. There's a reason they get overwhelmed. There's a reason they have higher degrees of distress, anxiety, and depression, and it's linked to that. So I think it's important that you've underlined it here and that we can
Yeah.
talk about it. Um, I'm so curious of time, and I'm conscious of it. And I have so many other things I'd like to bring up, but I'm curious about your own journey as a caregiver. And, we look at caregivers often with such resilience when they don't feel they're resilient and they're constantly scrambling and questioning themselves and saying, I'm not doing enough. I should be doing more. Did you learn anything about yourself along this journey? Was there anything that surprised you about your own capacities?
Um, I, yeah, now that you mention it, I think perhaps something I alluded to before previously is it is remarkable, and this is my experience. I don't know whether it's for everybody, but when you're in crisis, for me, anyways, I just get a real focus and a clarity in my thought. I know it seems strange, but it's almost like I know exactly, I can see sequentially I need to do these 8 things. And you almost wish to yourself, I wish I could have that focus and clarity on a daily basis, would make your working or whatever. But it escapes you after that moment's gone. So I don't know whether that's there's obviously something complex um, going on in your mind to give you that focus and clarity. The other thing I think, which most people will say, and most parents will say, and when you have busy kids and a busy life and a busy job, and you look back sometimes when you retire and you think, my God, how, or when the kids leave home and you're an empty nester, and you say, how do we ever get through all that and do everything else? And you do. There is I guess, a remarkable resiliency. And maybe the lesson there is to just sort of trust yourself with all our inadequacies and failings and whatever. That if you just keep at it, you're going to do some things right. And I think to your point, the verbal or the nonverbal communication, even if you don't always know what to say, being present and knowing that that person is there, regardless of what happens, that they're going to be that support. Hopefully that has a lot of meaning.
Thank you, Dave, so much for sharing your story. I think your expert advice, probably more of an expert on this than I am. It's really
I don't know about
appreciated
that.
and incredibly valuable. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Dave and Dr. Mehta, I'm emotional at this stage. That was one of the most beautiful, enlightening sessions I've seen on Caregiver and Caregivers, and to be frank, I've seen a lot. Dave, I particularly want to thank you for your openness and your transparency and your willing to share as you did. Dr. Mehta, thank you for guiding us through such a wonderful conversation. I'm confident that as we open up this session for Q&A, many will want to learn from both of you, and that's what we're going to do now. Thank you for staying on and for taking questions from our audience today. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for your patience. We're back here live with Dave, who can now can hear everything, and Dave has very openly and willingly agreed to answer as many questions as possible so that we can take in the next 7 or 8 minutes or so. Dave, the question I wanted to ask, and there's a couple of them related to this coming from the audience, is when should caregivers or how should the conversation happen around finances? Is that best as a conversation you can have with your partner, or did you feel at any stage that there was a desire or a wish to bring in a third party to have those conversations around money and finances?
That's a good question. Fortunately, in our circumstance, financially, we were okay, and my wife was sort of very cognizant of that aspect of it. So she was very proactive in terms of even before or as soon as the diagnosis, she was thinking in terms of, financial benefits, financial liabilities. So I think what I would advise is probably have that conversation at an early stage. Now, everybody's different. But I think probably because when you get into a later stage, after surgery, chemotherapy, radiation, the patient's going to be physically drained. And I think you want them to focus on just getting themselves physically better. So I think if you can address those situations, as difficult as it may be, when you're still feeling a little better. And then that will take a load off their mind, because the last thing they need to do is think, oh, what's going to happen? Or am I going to have to go back to work? And how am I going to do that? So my advice would be sooner rather than later.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice. Having conversations about money is never easy, period, but under the circumstances such as you are facing, even more difficult. Another question from our audience is like, how can I express to the person that I'm caring for that I'm struggling too? I just don't want to cause them any additional stress. So I know that you chatted a little bit about this with Dr. Mehta. Is there ways that, you're a great example of somebody who worked their way through it. How do you express to the person that you're caring for that you're struggling too?
I think what worked for me was having some individuals within my circle, whether that was extended family or friends, that I could meet with, go out for lunch, go for dinner, to kind of get a break. I wasn't particularly didn't particularly want to say to Michelle, hey, I'm struggling here, just because of all the things that she was going through. And I think maybe the way to do it is, if you are struggling, is get, if it's available, other resources, whether that be friends, siblings, whoever, to come in to kind of pinch hit, if you will, so that you're not, I don't think anyone can do it 24/7. And I know
Mhm.
maybe some
Mhm.
circumstances they have options, but if you can get other people to come in and say, hey, you know what, I'm going to come over and I'm going to spend um, the afternoon with Michelle, and that kind of gives me mentally a break. Um, so I guess without addressing that, saying to my partner, "Oh, I'm struggling a little," I would do that by saying, "Yeah, I am. I need a break, but I'm going to see if I can get people in." And plus, I think she liked to have. She didn't like to have a wide um, uh, network of friends come in. She kind of
Mhm.
initially tried to
Mhm.
keep. She only want to communicate to certain people, and that changes during the process. So I think it was kind of a win-win.
Yeah.
But
Was
I
there
guess
any time, and it's actually a bold question too, Dave. Thank you for clarifying that. But was there any time in a process where you might advise a caregiver to reach out for more, let me call it professional support, a social worker or a psychologist or someone of that nature?
yes, I think that would make sense, especially
Mhm.
having gone through it, because there
Mhm.
are a lot of resources available. I think part of the problem is you're not always aware of them at the time, and after you've been through it, you're more about what is available. But yes, I would. That's a very good point. I think I would recommend anybody to sort of put their hand up and say, yeah, is there professional that I can talk to, rather than wait to the point where you're struggling or you're having conflict with your partner, to avoid that situation, to give you strategies. Because there wasn't a lot of, there's a lot of literature when Michelle was initially diagnosed available.
Mhm.
And of course, a lot of information available on the internet. But in terms of the caregiver role, there was certainly didn't seem to be a lot of information that was accessible.
Yeah, thank you for that. Welcome, Dr. Mehta. Thank you for joining us. I hear we've had some troubles behind the scene. Can you hear Dave and I okay? Check, check,
I
check.
can.
Good.
I can hear
Thank
you
you for
both
joining us
okay.
for the Q&A. Fantastic. What we're chatting about is really the idea that some of the questions we're getting are, when is it important for a caregiver in the process to actually be engaged on a more professional level, say with a social worker or someone like yourself? At what point do their needs need to be brought into the conversation, particularly on a professional level?
I think we always look at capacity to function. And if the caregiver feels that they can get up, go through their routine um, without feeling a sense of overwhelm or a sense of dread, then things are okay. And so we kind of go through a quick checklist with them. So we ask questions that are kind of related to, when you wake up, is it hard for you to get out of bed? And if the answer is yes, then that's a point where we might say, okay, maybe you need to talk to someone. Do you ever feel overwhelmed in the day and need to stop and just take a minute to collect yourself? Sometimes that's another question that we ask. So really paying attention to cues is an important piece, and caregivers often struggle with that because they're so focused on somebody else. But if it gets to a point where functioning starts to feel a little bit more challenging, the getting out of bed, the doing things that they would normally do, not feeling pleasure in the caregiving role. Caregiving has been described as something that can be incredibly rewarding, and I think Dave often alludes to that, but has also been described as incredibly overwhelming and stressful. And I think in those cases, that's when we usually say, at least check in with somebody. They may say, you know what, everything's okay, you just need to take a break once in a while, that's fine. But sometimes it's a little bit more than that.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's knowing when that is. Thank you both for. I like the way Dave had also suggested that a wonderful circle of family and friends was very supportive, but there comes a time when you really need to assess whether or not
Mm.
having a more professional person to talk to is the right thing to do. There's a wonderful question here, and I think it actually applies to both of you. So I'm going to go back to you, Dave, because many members of our audience are actually new caregivers, and they're asking, well, what are those top maybe 3 or 4 questions I need to ask myself as I enter my new role as a caregiver. And Dr. Mehta, if you could comment from your side as well, that would be great. But I'll give you, Dave, the floor first.
So the sort of the top 3 or 4 questions to ask themselves, kind of. Is
Yeah,
that
as
the
a new
question?
caregiver, there's a lot of our audience they're new and they're going, well, where do I start? What questions should I
Yeah.
ask myself to begin?
Wow, that's a very good question. I'm just trying to go back to the
Thoughts.
beginning. Um, I
Dr.
think,
Mehta, yeah,
yeah,
please go
yeah.
ahead. I don't want to interrupt.
My first thought would be, you know, um, you're going to feel like you don't know anything about what you're supposed to do, and you're going to say, well, where do I start? And I think maybe the start is recognizing um, that you don't know, but having a belief that one day at a time you're going to get a little better. But that uncertainty can be overwhelming at times. But I guess maybe celebrate the small rewards and trust in yourself that you're going to get a little better despite your stumbles.
Thank you. What a wonderfully honest answer. Dr. Mehta, what are your words? As someone has entered a new role as a caregiver, what should they be asking themselves?
So when I present to caregivers, I actually have a caregiver checklist that's been kind of validated in the research. The
Oh, we
first
should get
question
that
is,
checklist from you.
it's understand what you're saying yes to. Often caregivers will say yes by default because they feel it's a role expected of them, and that there's a sense of duty there. But always ask sort of, okay, if I'm saying yes to being the caregiver, what does that entail? And the other piece to keep in mind is that caregiving roles and the demands change. So you may agree to taking your loved one to the hospital and to appointments, but you may not agree to administering medications. But that task may come later. So part of it is recognizing exactly what you're taking on. The second is that the role will evolve and change. So what feels okay at the beginning may not feel okay as you hit the middle, or if things unfortunately progress. The other question you need to ask yourself is, who is my support system around me? And Dave, I think, alluded to that very well. Who do I tag team with? If I say
Mhm.
yes to this and I have a day where I feel it's a bit too much, who are my go-to people? Who do I know can step in, and to have conversations with those people to say, hey, I'm agreeing to take care of mom, but there are days that it might get a bit overwhelming, or I might have work demands. Are you available if I need you to be? Um, the other is, what's my backup plan if I can't do it anymore? And caregivers don't like to think like that, but it's an important reflection to have. What is my backup plan if I can't do this anymore? And the other piece to always keep in mind is have the conversation with your loved one to say, okay, we're starting this journey together. I'd like you to check in on me as often as I check in on you. And so that creates a bit of reciprocity so that you're not in this role all by yourself, but you're looking after someone that you love. And so it can be, how are you doing with this? Or is this becoming too much for you? And permission for the caregiver to actually be honest about it is really important in terms of what the patient can do for the caregiver as well. So to have those ongoing dialogues is really important. And then I think I would just add at the end is, how am I going to take care of myself as I'm taking care of somebody else? Is there still space for me as I take on this role? So that's another important question that I think caregivers need to take a step back and to reflect. It is not an irreversible decision. And I really want to reiterate that, because it's okay to say yes if you feel that you can actually manage it. But it is absolutely okay to say, I'm overwhelmed now and I can't manage it anymore.
What an incredible, beautiful summary of everything. We really must get your checklist from you, and we will share that with the community because it is so deeply honest in so many ways. Thank you for that. That is the
Yeah.
end of this question.
Yeah.
Dave, did you want to add one
I was just
thing?
saying, I wish I had that checklist
I know, I know.
6 years ago.
Very ta-
Some great points in there, yeah.
yeah. Well, we will make sure that we do get it, and ensure that the community has the wonderful wisdom of Dr. Mehta. Thank you both for joining us. We'll have to end the session now. And thank you again for such a wonderful conversation that we've had.